Ch.80, land of the tender, body of gold hard pressed against desire. That boy was taken aback. Why? Lian thought back to that boy's strikes and moves when he killed those Binu, and casually showed off a few maneuvers.
You've never used a saber, right?
You use a sword, but the sword is tricky.
Although it's extremely fast
and aggressive, it's still rather restrictive, difficult to extend out. If you've never used a saber before, try it next time.
I think you might be even stronger with it. If ever Lian saw someone with a notable skill in martial arts, he couldn't help but want to approach
and talk.
It wasn't criticism of any sort, he really was just very interested and wanted to exchange ideas.
Because he possessed a wealth of experience in martial arts, oftentimes he didn't even need to think, just one glance and he could pick up on the particulars.
Even if he couldn't explain why what was, still he
would feel it must be so. Usually, out of respect for his status, people would listen, but there were very few who'd actually pay attention. However, that boy listened intently, gobbled up his suggestions, and would look down at the sword in his hand from time to time. Lian rambled on for a while, before suddenly, there were more rustling noises from within the woods.
Like something was crawling around rapidly.
Lian immediately remembered that they were still in danger, and it really wasn't the time and place to get excited. Right away, he became serious again.
Who knows if there might be more evil on this mountain? This place needs a thorough cleansing. That boy nodded vigorously, and presented that steel sword to Lian with both hands.
Lian shook
his head. Just defend yourself. You didn't leave earlier, and now there's no way for you to go.
I'll do my best to
protect you, but stay alert. Just then, the bushes rustled and something briskly jumped up.
Lian flicked his wrist to shoot out a
blast from his palm, and it hit dead on.
A terrible yelp, and that thing stopped moving. There was a strong stench of blood, and Lian was puzzled. If it was a Binu, then after having been blown up they would
leak sticky bodily fluids. The viscosity was such that the smell of blood usually wouldn't emit. So, he
approached to check. Pushing the bushes aside, there was indeed a large Binu on the ground, blown into several pieces from the
blast.
But that stench of blood didn't come from it, rather, from something in its mouth. It was a scrap of skin off a human head, with long hairs still attached. Binus were scavengers that foraged for scraps, and by the looks of it, a human had been killed. It left small drops of blood in its trail in the bushes, and Lian immediately followed it, that young soldier
tagging along right behind.
The further they walked, the thicker the spots of blood became, and the stronger that stench. Soon, they heard cries that sounded weak and powerless. That little soldier raised his sword and ran in front of Lian to shield him, but Lian pulled him back.
Behind.
Winding past a field of blooming shrubs, a semi-large cave appeared before them. That cave was probably the resting place of some passersby, but now corpses carpeted the ground. 20 to 30 Binu were clambering over those dead bodies, munching to their heart's content. There were also several of them surrounding a young woman. That young woman looked to be in pain, her guts split open, her innards spilling all over, but she herself was still alive. It appeared she might have been pressing herself, a bright red flower worn on her hair. The fresh blood complemented that crimson blossom, and the picture looked particularly cruel. Those Binu were licking at her fresh, steaming organs, ready to chomp, but hearing the sounds of someone approaching, they all turned to look, and charged in their direction.
Si Lian blew out a blast from his palm without blinking and slayed all of them before checking the dead bodies immediately after.
Among the corpses were men and women, old and young, their faces ashen, their attire simple. They were no doubt Yong'an civilians, and Si Lian couldn't help but be shocked. He had thought the sudden appearance of monsters and demons were called forth by that strange white-clothed being. That white-clothed being saved Lang Ying, so they must be allies, but then how come the Binu would feast on these Yong'an civilians?
Non-human creatures would never form a pact with humans.
For no reason, so did this mean this was the condition Lang Ying agreed to for the alliance? Were the lives of his followers his bargaining chips? Exclamation mark. That young woman was full of pain and terror, blood spitting from her lips, and she sobbed, "Don't kill me. I didn't do anything bad, don't kill me." In spite of himself, Si Lian recalled that family of 3 who died below the city walls, and what sins had they committed. He knelt and bent down, leaned over and spoke in a gentle, soothing voice. "Don't be scared. There's nothing to be scared of, we're here to save you." Yet that little soldier pointed his sword at the young woman. "Your Highness, be careful. She might be an evil spirit from the deep mountains." Of course Si Lian knew that was a big possibility, but after much consideration, he still felt he couldn't leave her alone. As long as he was prudent, it should be fine.
He felt the pulse of that young woman, checked her palm and fingers for prints, and instantly confirmed that she was indeed a human, and one
that had never practiced any martial arts, her arms limp and powerless.
He immediately began treating her.
He took out a bottle of medicine from his sleeve, twisted the cork open, and a faint white smoke
permeated slowly, its scent fragrant.
That medicine could temporarily slow down any poison, and was amazingly effective against wounds.
Si Lian didn't go stingy on the holy cure, and used up the entire bottle on her. "Do you feel better?"
That young woman's wounds were heavy, terrible to look at, but after sniffing in that smoke, some blood returned to her face, and she weakly nodded her head. "Are you from Yong'an?"
"How did this happen?" Si Lian asked. Tears rolled down that young woman's face.
I am. I don't know how this came to be either. Everything used to be just fine, but suddenly, my dad died, my brother died too." Si Lian gently patted her shoulders. "Who's the murderer who killed them? Or, what killed them?" That young woman sobbed. "The murderer who killed them was you." At the last word, her face suddenly turned fierce, her 2 eyes flashed and bulged. She opened her arms
and pounced, clutching Si Lian in her embrace. That young soldier had always been standing by, high on alert, and reacted extremely fast, immediately piercing her heart with his sword.
That young woman was already severely wounded, and after being stabbed, her death should have been a sure thing. Yet she started laughing uproariously in delight. clutching onto Si Lian firmly, refusing to let go, and stayed in that position until she at last stopped
breathing. She clung on so tightly that the young soldier strained to pull her dead body off.
He asked anxiously, "Your Highness, are you okay?"
Si Lian had thought that the young woman was going to ambush him as a last-ditch effort.
Yet, she had no weapons on her, she didn't even bite or scratch, and only clung on to him tightly as if that was enough.
Unrelenting even after death.
Confounded, he replied, "I'm all right, I." He trailed off as a sudden dizziness mockingly assaulted him. That little soldier widened his one bright eye. "Your Highness!" Exclamation mark. It was like Si Lian's innards were on fire, he couldn't speak, didn't want to speak, and didn't want to hear anyone speak either. He shook his head and raised his hand, unspeaking. All around them came the sound of a woman giggling. He 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 he.
He 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 he.
The two of them startlingly realized there wasn't a third person around. That giggling came from that
bright red flower. Si Lian instantly understood he'd fallen into a trap.
Land of the tender. This land of the tender wasn't that land of the tender. 11. The land of the tender was a flower demon that loved to gather and suck to feast on the essence of men, living off of their blood. Their fragrance wasn't anything good, and Si Lian immediately cautioned, "Cover your mouth and your nose tight, don't breathe in that flower's fragrance."
That young soldier already had bandages wrapped securely around his face and had a layer of filter, so he didn't breathe in any scent.
Hearing Si Lian, he tightened his bandages, but then realized Si Lian had
nothing to cover with, so he ripped a piece off of the cleanest part of his sleeve, rubbed it hard, patted it
down until it was cleaner, and passed it in both hands. Yet Si Lian said, "No need.
It's too late."
When he went to treat that young woman, he may have been guarded, but he didn't guard against scent. And was pressed closely, not knowing the flower pinned on her hair was a blossom of land of the tender. Before she died, she clung on firmly to Si Lian, ensuring she wouldn't fail. This meant Si Lian had already unknowingly inhaled many mouthfuls of that tender fragrance, truly refreshing the spirit.
Once the tender fragrance entered the body, men would become impetuous.
Numbness to start, then
mania.
Right then, Si Lian's whole body was already listless, like all of his nerves were removed. Once the numbness passed, he'd become a cask of explosives. If that strange white-clothed being was to appear once more, Si Lian really didn't know how certain he'd be able to face it, and he couldn't be sure of its might either. His first reaction was to reach for his bottle of medicine, but then he realized that bottle was emptied to help treat that young woman.
Yet, in the end, the person still didn't survive. He glanced at the dead body next to him.
That young woman wore a happy smile as if she was sincerely glad to sink the enemy into a trap before death and could finally pass in peace to see her family.
Si Lian
could only blame the bloody scene that softened that flower's dangerous shade, and the stench of blood that lightened the strange fragrance of blossoms. He had never imagined that the face of a young girl only
in her teens could bear such resentment, that she could commit such an extreme act. Around him, the flower demons were exploding with excitement, muttering.
He took the bait. Caught him. It's really His Highness the Crown Prince. It's him. He's so handsome, my root can't hold back any longer, it's going to thrust out of the ground. That young soldier swung his sword to slash, cleaving a field of flower shrubs. Yet those stems were
nimble, and that sword was worn. After one slash, it became dull. Those flower demons rocked back and
forth, squealing. My gosh. This little Gege, your bush hasn't even grown in yet, but you're so ferocious.
I'm on the verge of blooming. How will you repay me? That young soldier's eye was flashing with rage.
You're dead. I'm gonna burn you all to death. The green leaves of those flower demons perched on the stems, yelling, my, so scary.
We didn't provoke.
Why are you so mad? Si Lian spoke up too, don't burn them.
They're demons. If you set them on fire, they will emit
poisonous gas. You can't pull them out either. That boy immediately dropped the hands that were ready to pluck, and Si Lian explained weakly, there are poisonous thorns all over the stems. The flower demons flirtatiously gibed, my gosh, your highness is so sweet, thank you for protecting us. Just wait, we're going to bear fruits soon.
We'll definitely take good care of you. He.
Men who cultivated abstinence from birth are so hard to come by, even if your power will drop a level if we deflower you, there's no other way, sorry. He. The flower petals of the land of the tender rubbed against each other, giggling, their ambrosial perverse
intentions more than obvious.
That young soldier was bewildered, not quite understanding the meaning of abstinence, deflower, or level, but he could still tell they didn't mean anything good, so he continued
to swing his sword madly, cutting down the flowers, roaring in rage, trying desperately to cover up the
sound of that teasing laughter, not wanting Si Lian to hear. Si Lian, on the other hand, was cracking his knuckles. So, that was it. So everything that transpired tonight was truly designed especially for dealing with him. Kidnapping Qirong was them counting on the pride and consideration he possessed as the martial god of Xianlei, that he would for sure choose to come after them alone, minimizing the situation. And that heavily wounded young woman was meant to use up his medicine, leaving him powerless to relieve himself.
The cooperation between humans and demons was meant to lead him to this point.
Si Lian's method of cultivation really did require a body of purity.
The followers who worshipped the ascended cultivators who practiced this stream were firmly convinced in the transcendence of the gods, who were untouched by earthly desires. Thus, if they couldn't protect their purity, their following would
no doubt collapse, devastating their powers.
Although it wouldn't be serious to the point of falling back
into mortality from godhood, and there was still the possibility of redemption after many more years of cultivation, but at that very moment, there was no way, no time for him to sit behind closed doors to cultivate for years. The statute of purity was strict at the Royal Holy Pavilion, and Si Lian excelled as the number one in upholding those rules, never having broken or breached any of them, and thought himself as steady as a rock of steel. Not even gales could ripple the water in his heart. He also went through many trials, completing them perfectly each time. Yet, even if his heart was as still as water, he was still young and easily unnerved. With a little young soldier right beside him, listening to those flower demons blatantly splashing words of depravity onto him, plus that lingering fragrance making his blood boil, his mind tempestuous. Si Lian couldn't help but become embarrassed, his face reddening.
But no matter what, he
just couldn't stand. He could still somehow hang on for the moment, but if those Land of the Tenders really bore fruit, then it'd be very troublesome. The best course of action was of course to return to the royal capital immediately and have Feng Xin and Mu King shield him, but Si Lian's legs were limp, he could barely stand. Without any other way, he called to the little soldier with a strained voice, "You, come over here."
MXTX author notes. Losing virginity will only damage spiritual power, not martial might.
Although martial might and spiritual
power can be combined and amplified, their nature is different.
Besides, only Si Lian's chosen stream is this troublesome, that an X-life would damage his cultivation.
Some heavenly officials are much smarter,
and would choose a stream where the more they X the stronger they become, but in most streams an X
life and cultivation are completely unrelated.
11. When Ro Xiang, Land of the Tender, has historically referred to a brothel or aphrodisiac, MXTX is creating her
own version of Land of the Tender here.
For those who aren't familiar, Land of the Tender is a common concept in Chinese fantasy, and readers expect seductresses and/or love poison when they see it in the text.
Next chapter.
Ch.81, Land of the Tender, body of gold hard pressed against desire 2. Hearing him, that young soldier's back flinched and froze. He turned around hesitantly, but didn't dare go over. The situation at hand didn't allow for any time wasted. Seeing his hesitation, temper flared in Si Lian's chest, but he forced it down. "Don't be scared, I won't do anything to you.
Get over here, quick."
At last, that boy moved. He rushed close to Si Lian's side, but came to an abrupt stop 2 feet away. Si Lian sucked in a breath silently and extended a hand towards him.
"Help me up, take me away."
That young soldier very carefully took that hand and grasped it. It was like a man on the brink of death had finally found someone to rely on, and in an instant, Si Lian's entire body slackened, and collapsed onto that boy.
Sunken deep in the tender fragrance, his temperature was high, his body burning.
Yet somehow that boy's hands were equally as hot, and there was even slight trembling. Si Lian leaned on him for a bit, saved some energy, then inhaled and pushed himself to stand. He didn't
want to have someone smaller than him support his person entirely, but with the boy's help, they walked agonizingly for a few steps. Those flower demons called out to him when they saw them move away. "No, Your Highness, don't leave us.
He is waiting for you on the road, so if you leave here, you'll bump into him." Who's he? Si Lian demanded. Speaking of that person, even the Land of the Tenders was slightly terrified.
After some hesitation, they mumbled, "He is him."
The flowers all nodded to each other. He is him.
The one who brought us here.
Even if they didn't dare to speak of that person's name or identity, that half-crying, half-smiling mask immediately appeared in Si Lian's mind.
"So what you're saying is if I go back now, then the one who planted you all will hunt me down halfway on the road, but if I stay here, he won't come, correct?"
The flower demons were pleased and chatted as they nodded their heads.
Fury burst into flames in C. Lian's chest.
To trap him without killing him in this hateful situation, were they playing with him? Why not simply just
battle to the death? He collected himself and forced down his irritation.
It seemed the other party had no intention of facing him head-on, and only wanted to damage his spiritual power, make him fall from grace, and lose followers. Those flower demons may not be speaking the truth, even if they told lies, if he thought about it, even though this boy could support him or carry him on his back, they still might not be able to return safely. Should the other party purposely throw some women at them halfway down the road, the situation might get even worse or more awkward.
After some consideration, Si Lian exhaled a feverish breath and closed his eyes. Take me to the cave over there.
That young soldier followed his instructions and helped him cross over that ground piled with corpses.
When they came before the cave, Si Lian gasped in a low voice.
Stop! That little soldier halted. Even just raising a hand, Si Lian shook uncontrollably.
Where's your sword?
That boy supported him with his left arm and freed the right to take out his sword. Si Lian extended his hand, rolled up the sleeves and revealed a small part of his arm. Under the white moonlight, it was
smooth and pale like the softest white jade. That boy suddenly held his breath, but Si Lian didn't notice.
He ordered, still in a low voice, stab me.
The hand that held up the worn sword immediately dropped.
Si Lian prompted, don't worry, just stab, and stab deeply. I need to draw an array. There's no other
spiritual devices on hand, so there needs to be blood.
However, that young soldier protested. Your Highness, please use my blood. And he raised his own arm
and carved without holding back.
Si Lian hurriedly said, no need. Your blood. But his words didn't make it in time. A deep gash had already appeared on the boy's arm, fresh blood
flowing from it.
Si Lian sighed. Sigh, never mind.
Si Lian's blood was an invaluable holy treasure, so how could a mortal's blood compare?
But seeing how sincere this little soldier was, he couldn't bear to tell him that what he'd done was pointless.
Instead, he said, thanks.
But we still need some of my blood as a catalyst.
Thus, Si Lian took that sword, and with trembling hands, it took him a few tries before successfully
stabbing into the center of his arm. Crimson holy blood streamed down his white arm and dripped into
2 curved lines before the cave, drawing 2 barriers.
It could be said to be a waste of God's gift.
Si
Lian also took care to mix in some of that boy's blood, and after completing the array, the dizziness grew
stronger.
Let's go in. It was dark inside the cave. That boy took out a small flare torch from inside his robes, ignited it, and the firelight brightened their surroundings with intense light. That young soldier's face was hidden behind the bandages, covering him completely, yet Si Lian's discomposure was open for all to see. His cold sweat sticky, his hair disheveled, his lips red and swollen. It was the cut created when he bit his lips to sanctify his own sword earlier. The firelight stabbed at Si Lian's eyes, hurting him, and the waves of heat were also torturing him. Si Lian demanded immediately, don't light the fire, kill it.
That boy immediately threw the small flare torch on the ground and stepped to extinguish it, and they
sank into darkness once more. After being helped into the cave, Si Lian sat himself down and seated into a meditative position. A moment later, he spoke laboriously. I have a mission for you, can you do it? That boy dropped to the ground, kneeling.
I'm willing to risk my life to do my duty.
Si Lian painfully restrained his heavy breathing and said with a forced calm, I drew 2 sets of barriers in front of the cave. The outer barrier is to ensure nothing outside gets in, the inner barrier is to prevent anyone inside from getting out. He gasped harshly for air silently, then continued, there's enough space between the 2 barriers for 1 person. Stay there and watch over the cave entrance.
No matter what you hear outside, don't go out.
Same logic, don't come in no matter what sounds you hear from me. That boy was slightly perplexed. Your Highness, you're staying here by yourself? Yes, Si Lian said.
I don't know what I'll do. In any case, you can't come in no matter what.
Under the circumstances, Si Lian couldn't leave. But waiting for reinforcements, Qi Rong was probably still stumbling down the road, and just the trip back to the royal capital would take a long while. Who knew when reinforcements would come? He could only seal off this small area temporarily, set off wards, and figure out a way to treat the tender fragrance. He rasped, fruits born of flower demons are powerful temptresses.
They're most likely going to ripen
soon.
Just then, the fragrance in the air suddenly surged, cutting off his words.
That gentle infectious scent filled the air from the earth to the sky, and the flower demons let out ecstatic, delicate cackling.
They trumpeted, my root.
My root is hard. The fruits have ripened. Smelling that exceedingly sweet fragrance, Si Lian could feel his heart beating faster, and blood rushed to his brain. He gritted his teeth. Hurry and go. Don't breathe in that scent, and if they get close, don't be scared.
Nothing can cross that
bloodline, but as long as your feet remain inside the barrier you can strike them with your sword. That boy glanced outside, nodded with conviction and rushed out with the sword in hand, stationing himself between the 2 bloodlines by the entrance of the cave. Outside the cave, in that field of corpses,
bushes of flower shrubberies grew vividly in color. That briar field was quivering as if something beneath
was about to rupture the ground. Soon, there was indeed something that broke out. It was the head of a woman. That woman's head sprouted from beneath the soil, breathed in the fresh air above ground, and looked to be drunk with joy, her eyes squeezing shut into crescent lines. Following immediately after was a round
and smooth shoulder, and then an entire arm crawled out.
The fruits of the land of the tender were formed under the whiskers of their roots.
When their fruits
ripened, they shape into various forms of women. The time of ripening had come, and countless naked women broke out from the earth.
They raised their
arms to pluck those bright red blossoms from their heads and bathed under the moonlight, stretching
their limbs to their heart's content.
It was those little flowers that emitted that fragrant scent, but now the ones secreting that sweet odor were those enchanting women. They patted off the remaining mud on their bodies, fixed their hair, and walked towards the cave, giggling seductively. Your Highness, we're coming.
That sweet fragrance also suffocatingly filled the interior of the cave.
Si Lian sat in the lotus position,
with his eyes closed, chanting the Ethics Sutra mentally.
Yet, it had little use. Those flower demons called
To him without shame, chirping familiar language like baby, sweetheart, gege, didi.
12. All sorts of monikers. Throwing his mind into turmoil, so Si Lian changed to reciting out loud. 5 sights cause blindness, 5 sounds cause deafness, galloping hunts cause madness, rare goods cause obstructions, calm over impatience, coldness over heat, silence is the ultimate virtue. Those who are kind will receive kindness, those who are unkind will receive unkindness. 13. Si Lian had not noticed at all that the sutra he had memorized without fault was recited incoherently.
Outside the cave, the flower demons clapped and laughed tauntingly.
My dear Crown Prince, my sweetheart, my good highness, you're not a monk, why are you reciting sutras, I.O.? Suddenly there was shrieking all over, and it sounded like that young soldier had wordlessly become violently aggressive, chopping and slashing madly, chasing those flower demons away as they cried murder. Some yelled from far away, you cursed little brat, little destroyer of beauty.
No tenderness in your heart at all.
Scary, scary. Vicious at such an age. Imagine him full grown. Those flower demons were trying to squish themselves into the cave like starving beasts, but they just couldn't squeeze in. They didn't notice the blood array on the ground and had thought the blockage was all caused by that boy.
After some discussion, they gathered not too far away and called to him.
Little Gege, why must you block us from going in?
It's not like we're going to do anything bad, we just want to have a good time with His Highness.
Be good, little soldier, and don't hinder us from doing His Highness some good. That little Didi is so mean. A shame that he's so young, too tender. He probably doesn't even know what doing good means. The flower demons fell over themselves over another round of mocking giggles, and Si Lian blinked open his eyes slightly, only to see at the entrance of the cave stood a black shadow, one of that boy who, with a sword in hand, was determined to never move, even in death. Suddenly, one of the flower demons said, I say, little Gege, don't stick yourself in there like a hard shaft. What are you planning?
Why not come with me over there to have some fun?
What sorts do you fancy? Do you like my type?
That young soldier still didn't respond.
Those flower demons thought in order to enter the cave they must pass by him, so they all brought forth their tricks, coddling with their words. What about me?
How about this?
Do you fancy my sort? Look at me, do you like this? Yet from flirtation at the beginning changing to complaints then to curses at the end, that boy still only ignored them if they were far away, and struck at them if they were close. Si Lian knew that, before land
of the tenders emerged from the ground, they could change their own shapes at will.
He had wanted to warn the boy, but due to his current distressing predicament he daren't open his mouth. Finally, at last, when those pressing waves of heat passed, was he able to gasp, don't look at them.
Just fighting against the hot blood rushing to his head already exhausted him, so Si Lian's voice was
terribly soft and low, but that young soldier instantly heard him and cried in response, yes sir. Your
Highness, how are you? I'm fine, Si Lian said. If things get too hard, shut your eyes, seal your nose and your mouth.
That young soldier hadn't had a chance to answer when another flower demon suddenly burst out laughing. I know. Little guy, I bet your favorite type must look like this.
It sounded as if another new land of the tender had emerged.
There was a sudden dead silence that blanketed outside the cave. That young soldier also seemed to have stopped breathing. The next second, the crashing waves of laughter of those flower demons surged against Si Lian, drowning him.
They clapped and screeched. AIYOOHH!
Exclamation mark. What a hand. What a HAANNNDDD. Exclamation mark.
My God.
How did you come up with this? It's the best HAHAHAHAHAHAH. Look. That brat is completely stunned. I bet it's like this. It must be like this.
And here I thought that shitty brat is a rock.
WHO knew we
were wrong.
Such balls at such an age. You win, we are nothing. How about it, little guy? Come quick and enjoy this sweet delicious sight. There won't be another shop that serves this dish if you leave this land.
If you don't seize your chance.
Now, even if you dream for 800 years, you still won't be able to have a taste. Or, do you want us to give you a hand? That state, he.
That young soldier was thoroughly incensed, and his tone of voice was filled with frost.
You are seeking death!
Exclamation mark.
At the same time, inside the cave Si Lian was about to reach his limit. His sight blurred and his ears drummed. He could no longer sit up straight. He collapsed forward and barely held himself from the ground with his hands.
But this tumble loosened his gritted teeth, and in
that moment of delirium, a painful, wretched moan escaped his lips. 12dd is the familiar address for little brother. 13. These are verses from the Ethics Sutra, Tao Te Ching, the Book of the Way of Virtue by Lao Tzu. It's a Chinese literary classic alongside the I Ching and also one of the philosophical foundation texts for Taoism.